So our final lesson for this week, lesson 5, is going to be factoring when a is equal to 1. What do I mean by that? Well, we knew how to factor in standard form when there was no bx term. But now we're going to have our standard form, and there is going to be a bx term. And when I say a is equal to 1, I mean that there's going to be no coefficient larger than 1 in front of the x squared. So everything is going to look like this. Okay? No coefficient in front of x squared. These two signs can change, b and c can change, but there will always just be an x squared right at the front when we use what's called our AM method. So our objective for this lesson is we can factor a quadratic equation from standard form with a leading coefficient of 1. So a lot of teachers, they just call this general factoring. I like to give it a name, and I call it the AM method. So why do I call it the AM method? That's because for this method, we're going to figure out what adds to a number and what multiplies to a specific number. So we're going to look at the first example. So step 1, whenever we're going to find the zeros or the x-intercepts of a quadratic equation, we're going to plug in 0 for y. So I'm going to replace it, rewrite the right side of my equation, and that's step 1. Step 2 is where the AM method comes into play. And that involves us finding factors, finding two numbers that add to the b term. So if I look up here, the b term is the one next to x. So we want to add to 2 and multiply to the c term. The c term is the constant, the number by itself. In this case, the -8. So that's why it's called the AM method. Adds to 2, multiplies to -8. So I'm going to start writing out my factors of -8. So let's see, I've got 1 times -8. I could switch the signs and say -1 times a +8. If I was to multiply both of these, I'd get -8 back. Now, 1 and -8, that doesn't add to 2, and -1 and 8 doesn't add to 2. So it must be two different factors. So I'm going to keep going. I'm going to go in order. I'm going to do 2 times -4 would give me -8. But 2 minus 4 does not give me 2, so that can't be it. Maybe I could switch the signs. So I'm going to switch the signs because it still gives me a -8. And let's see, -2 plus 4. That is a +2. So since these two numbers both multiply to -8 and combine or add to give me a +2, those are going to be my factors. So now that we know our factors, we're going to write them out as binomials. Remember, binomials means two terms. So I'm going to put my 0 because that's going to stay. And binomial factors are just a fancy name for my double bubble. So I'm going to do my double bubble. Now here's the thing. What's going to go in front of the bubbles? Well, I need something that multiplies to x squared. Well, x times x gives me x squared. So that's what's going to go in the front of my bubbles. So maybe you want to put that down in your notes. The x goes in the beginning of the bubble for each one. Now, my factors are -2 and 4. So that's what's going to go into each bubble. I'm going to put a -2 into the first bubble and a +4 into the second bubble. Now I'm in factored form. So let's write that down. Factored form, which is what we just did in the previous lesson with zero product property. So that must mean step 4 is to use the zero product property, ZPP, to solve. So that means I'm going to do my T-chart. I'm going to set each of my factors equal to 0 and solve. So I'm going to add 2 for the first one. X must equal 2. There's my first x-intercept. And I'm going to subtract 4 for my second one. So here is my second x-intercept. So now you have successfully solved your first quadratic in standard form when there is a b term. So the real new steps are, can you find the factors? After that, it's just zero product property. So let's do another example together. So I'm going to follow my steps. Step 1, plug in 0 for y. Step 2, AM method. Find factors that add to the b term. So I'm going to add to -5 and multiply to the c term. So it has to multiply to 6. So that means I'm going to write out my factors of 6. So let's start with 1 times 6 gives me 6. -1 times -6 gives me 6. Well, these two, they don't add up. They add up to 7, so that's not it. And these two add up to -7. So got to keep going. Let's try +2 and +3. When you multiply them, you get 6. When you add them, you get +5. But I need a -5. So let's try -2 and -3. A negative times a negative gives me a +6. And a -2 minus a 3 or plus a -3 gives me -5. So there's my two factors. Now you don't have to write this out on the side every single time, but it may be helpful to you. So it's up to you. So now step 3, write out my binomial factors. So that means do my double bubble. And what goes in front of each double bubble? X does. So I'm going to put X and X. My factors are going to go inside my bubble. So -2 is going to go in the first one. -3 is going to go in the second one. And now I have to use the zero product property to solve. So see if you could figure out first on your own, what are my two x-intercepts going to be? Hopefully you did a t-chart. You set each of your factors equal to 0. And now you get x by itself. So we're going to add 2 here to get x by itself. So our first x-intercept is 2. And we're going to add 3 to the second one. So our second x-intercept is 3. Done. Now I'm going to kind of walk you through so you can do the third example on your own. So step 1, plug in 0 for y. Step 2, AM method. So I'd like you now to try and figure out, what are your two numbers going to be that add to the b term and multiply to the c term? So you want to add to a -3, and you want to multiply to a -10, which means I have to find my factors of -10. So if you went through each one, you probably did 1 times -10 first. That doesn't give me -3. -1 and a +10 still doesn't work. Then you moved on to 2 and -5, because they give you a -10. And 2 plus -5 gives you -3. So those are your two factors. So hopefully after that, you did your double bubble. And what's going to go in front of each bubble? X and X. Then you're going to take your two numbers, put them inside the bubble. Lastly, now use zero product property to solve. So do your t-chart. Set each factor equal to 0. And get x by itself. So your first one should have been -2. And your second factor should have been 5. And maybe you noticed by now, whatever the sign is in the bubble, when you solve, it switches to get your intercepts. So +2 became -2, -5 became +5, negative, positive, negative, positive. So if you notice that little trick, feel free to use it. So this is what your Homework is going to focus on this week is zero product property and AM method. Feel free to bring any questions you have to our office hours.